what we have here in Florida is worth protecting.
This is what we're designing for. We're designing for a resilient bioregion, a healthy bioregion, the health of our water at scale, and how does our development and our food systems and our housing and our social systems and transportation fit into this overall design goal. We don't have that framework yet. Healthy soil cleans and filters water. As it rains down in the ground and soaks through the soil, the little microbes eat some of the nutrients and the pollutants out of the water, and it soaks down into our aquifers and up through our springs and becomes the hydrological cycle.
Welcome to the Ground Up Podcast. Conversations about building biodiversity, resilience, and sustainability from the ground up.
Caleb, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out to visit. It's been nice showing you around the farm.
It's a beautiful place you have here. A lot of really important work you're doing.
Thank you. And you're doing a lot of great work in Tampa Bay and beyond, and that's what I'd love to hear more about. I'm really fascinated by your story, like how you came to be here doing this type of work, and love to hear about that.
Sure. Yeah, a little bit of a circuitous path. I started with a passion for football and ended up spending working for the Florida Gators and then the Miami Dolphins, and then spent most of my early career with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a project management and operations role there. And then really loved it. I got to be there through that process, including a Super Bowl with Tom Brady. But started noticing little by little the passion shifting. And one day I kind of had an aha moment as I was going to work one day of like, I'm listening to, at the time, it was a Charles Eisenstein podcast on the way to work instead of sports radio, and kind of had this aha that, my passion has shifted. And through that process started the journey of, okay, now that my passion has shifted, well, working in football doesn't make as much sense anymore. So what's next for me, and how do I live out this passion? And I had come across environmental regeneration, which I'm sure we'll talk some about today. And kind of just the way that life works, and started seeing through my own personal journey, like seeing that was how nature worked and how life worked, and that there was a lot of need for communication into the business world and support in the business world about how to have a voice at the table and how to do things in a way that were more life oriented. And so out of that, I ended up leaving the Buccaneers and starting, I guess now about 4 years ago, started Regenerative Shift. Which is holistic environmental consulting around life-centered practices. So our slogan is life at the center of business.
I love that, by the way. Life at the center of business. When I read that, it really resonated with me, because I think about that in terms of what we do as well. We want to put life back at the center of farming, and life back at the center of our landscapes. To hear you say that was, just really powerful resonance. So what does that mean to you, to put life back at the center of business?
So I think, whether it's business or whether it's personal decisions that we make, on any given day, there are, certainly dozens, maybe hundreds or more decisions that we make. But in the context of business, there are decisions to how you grow your business, how you spend your money, how you do different things to operate the business. And so one of the key things that I look at is adding a question to the decision-making process of how does life fit into this? And so that's a little esoteric. A lot of, in practicality, a lot of the work that we're doing is around renewable energy efficiency, regenerative landscaping projects, things that, are kind of the low-hanging fruit of sustainability, moving towards more the planting of the seeds of life. But it's, I think at its core, right, there's a mindset shift of, thinking a little bit differently about how decisions are made, right? How do we put life into the process? So when you're deciding, what to purchase, what to do as a business, what market to go into, how to do things, well, is there a space to ask a question of how life fits into that? And then usually if you ask that question, very different outcomes and possibilities emerge.
So who are you asking this question to?
So, kind of an example. So one of very early in Regenerative Shift, I came from working for the Buccaneers in the stadium, and there was the very first conversation I was having with a former colleague after I left the Bucs and started the business was with a colleague who worked for the Tampa Sports Authority. And I'm explaining this concept like, well, regeneration and life at the center, what does that mean? And he says, hey, Caleb, I don't know what you're talking about, but I have a purchase order on my desk to buy an aluminum fence. Should I do something different? And what was going on at the stadium, they had a curb jumping problem in one of their parking lots where it was primarily after the game, the traffic was a little bit bad. And so people would run over this little small hedge that they had in their F-350s after they had a little liquid courage and would leave the parking lot, and it created, traffic issues and stuff like that. And so they were going to do what any business would, and let's put a physical barrier up, an aluminum fence that would stop that barrier. And but by asking the question, should we do something different, that creates the opportunity to say, well, we need a physical barrier, and that could be done with an aluminum fence, but that also could be done with many other things. And what do we want to look at doing that? How do we do that in a life-centered way? And that culminated a few months later in a planting project at Raymond James Stadium of 150 bamboo plants, and then some native plants near to the trees where the physical barrier wasn't as needed. That was still provided the physical barrier. You're not driving your cars through the bamboo. It's going to stop you. It does so in a way that I think is, it's hard to say things that are objectively more beautiful, but I think growing bamboo is more beautiful than an aluminum fence by most metrics. It costs less money than the aluminum fence to put the plants in. We benefited for there already being irrigation there, so some of the other costs that might have come in were not there. It sequesters carbon. Bamboo, and this type of bamboo is a relatively slow-growing bamboo, but bamboo grows and sequesters carbon in the soil as opposed to being extractive and emitting carbon like an aluminum fence would. It puts carbon in the ground. It got news coverage to come out and cover it. We actually are on the news. You can see it on my website. Fox News came out and covered this story, so it gets positive press. And then shortly after we planted it, Coldplay was coming through the stadium. And Coldplay, I don't know if you know, but they have a big sustainability focus. They did a sustainability report for the global tour that took place in 2022 and 2023. And they brought out like the sustainability manager and the tour manager out to see this fence shortly after it was planted to say, look what we're doing. Look at how we're doing things. So it checks a lot of boxes across the business, right? Like it still meets the business need of the physical barrier, but does so in a way that creates all these marketing and positive and environmental benefits that come with it, that come from just asking a question in the process, right? It comes from him saying, hey, should we do something different? How do we put life at the center of this decision? And so I think there's an opportunity across, how many decisions is the stadium or different businesses making every day on what they're spending money on? And if you could factor in that question into the process with a little creativity, maybe get very different outcomes.
That's a powerful question. Just asking one question shifted the whole direction of that project. Did the individual you were working with, did he come to understand what you meant by putting life at the center of business after this experience?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, it's the stadium is far from regenerative, right? There's a lot of things going on there, but there was several people involved in the process that we were talking a little bit earlier today about the landscapers and stuff there. There was a lot of education of people who've spent a career and a lifetime learning about agronomy and how to horticulture that hadn't been exposed to a lot of these ideas. And it's impacting the way that they see the decisions that are coming on, and hopefully we'll have ripples down the line.
So tell me more about your thoughts on regeneration, because I often hear about regenerative agriculture, and in my world we talk a lot about regenerating soil health, but you've really taken this to encompass a much broader scope. Yeah,
well, I think soil health it's a good place to start. the regenerative movement in its current branding kind of came out of the regenerative agriculture movement, with the Joel Salatins and the Rodales and the Alan Savorys and some of the stuff they were doing. And in many ways, indigenous cultures for thousands of years or longer kind of being connected with soil health and with nature in terms of agriculture. And that's a really good place to start with regeneration. I mean, when you have healthy soil, it it grows healthier food if you're in an agricultural setting, and that can be verified. It is, the building block of biodiversity, and there's if you have a handful of soil that is been farmed with industrial agriculture and sprayed with Roundup and these other chemicals, it might have literally no life in it whatsoever in a handful, whereas healthy soil, whether regenerative agriculture or just soil that's healthy on its own, will have more microbes, more life in it in a handful than there are people on the planet. And those are the little microbes that are, the bottom of the food chain that, are eaten by the plants and eaten by the beetles, and all the way up to where you have the whole food chain and ecosystem that's in place. So regenerative agriculture, healthy soil is critical for biodiversity and for the health of our systems. It's also, in my region in Tampa Bay and really throughout all of Florida and much of the world, we have water quality issues. We have in Tampa Bay, we have common to have red tides that cause that cause death to fish and manatees, and then also have huge economic impacts when beaches are closed because you can't sell the beachfront property, you can't get the economic development that comes from the tourism around this asset that we have in our region. Well, healthy soil cleans and filters water. As it rains down in the ground and soaks through the soil, the little microbes eat some of the nutrients and the pollutants out of the water, and it soaks down into our aquifers and up through our springs and becomes the hydrological cycle. And has the added benefit of reducing the biggest pollutant that we have to our waterways, which is the way we do landscaping and agricultural our landscaping and agricultural practices with the herbicides and pesticides and fungicides and all this fertilizer that we're putting on there. That's the biggest pollutant that we have. And then when I first learned this, it was a big aha for me, and was one of the reasons initially I started Regenerative Shift, was that healthy soil sequesters tons and tons of carbon. And there's different studies that have been done. The Rodale Institute has published a peer-reviewed study in 2014 and then updated it in 2020 that said, if we were able to transition our agricultural and pasture land to regenerative practices, it can, offset our carbon as a planet, right? We could be a net zero planet. And I don't know if that's, it's easier said than done, right? As you know, in your industry, and there's a lot of land out there, a lot of things to transition, but it's a big puzzle piece. Just on the soil health is a great place to start, and that's where a lot of the regenerative movement has grown from. And but regeneration, as it's evolving as a movement, and as Regenerative Shift is involved with it, is really certainly very much for regenerative agriculture and different soil health practices, but it's expanding it outside of agriculture. So at one level, it's looking at just regenerative land management and recognizing that the same principles for biodiversity and water quality and carbon sequestration apply whether or not it's an agricultural setting. And there's a lot of land out there that currently is being managed with pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers that are not regenerative, right? And so there's an opportunity to expand soil health well beyond just the agricultural setting. And then really it's looking at kind of the systems view and seeing how nature works, and recognizing that being life-centered, as I talked about a little bit ago, how are we designing our regions and our systems and our businesses around the principles of life, which will affect the soil, certainly affect our water quality, but also will have ripples, throughout all of the way that we do business.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the systems approach, because I find that is still a fairly novel approach to solving problems and to thinking about solutions. And yet I find that by taking a whole systems approach, we can really understand more clearly how everything is connected and relating to each other, and from that approach, I think we come up with better solutions. So I appreciate your perspective on that. So tell me a little bit more about how you're implementing this with your clients, and what types of pathways you have to push regenerative thinking and regenerative solutions in your region.
Well, at one level, right, the market for large scale landscape regenerative transitions is pretty new, and is something that is certainly in its infancy. And so most of, if we're talking about, paying clients and supporting the business and how the business is growing, a lot of that really is less about things that I would consider regenerative and more about really some of the low-hanging fruit that's out there. And so in 2022, there was a major environmental legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, that passed under the Biden administration, and that provided tax credits, incentives, grants for basically any sector of the economy that was doing anything related to renewable energy, energy efficiency, or decarbonization. And it had upwards of $1 trillion of funding tied to it. And so if you want to get some business advice on how to have a successful business, have $1 trillion of funding kicked into your industry shortly after you start. It's a good place to start. So I was really able to benefit through a lot of that, but was able to spend a lot of time learning that. I was marketing myself as a holistic environmental consultant, and you can't be holistic if you don't know where $1 trillion of funding is flowing. And so I learned it, and have really, in many cases, worked with lots of clients, including yourself, on different projects related to solar, renewable energy, and how to do those projects in a way that it checks all the boxes for the government funding. Through that, there's an opportunity to have deeper conversations and to build relationships that grow over time. When we're talking about the idea that I mentioned earlier of putting life at the center of business and adding a question to the decision-making process, that's a mindset shift. That is a different way of thinking. Systems thinking is a different way of thinking. And businesses, people, individuals, that's hard. It's a process to change your mind. And it's something that typically comes from internal, crisis or some internal motivator. But if it comes from anything external, it almost always comes from somebody you trust. Right. And so how ways to build trust are that how do you help clients, do the projects they're doing, get the funding that they're looking to do, start to get that low hanging fruit, and then have conversations about, it's on my website, how do you plant those seeds? So how do you, when we're working with a school district and helping them get funding for their solar projects and helping them get funding for their electric buses, how does that then turn into conversations on, you're putting together a district sustainability plan. How do we look at that? How do we start to see what food waste diversion in your schools could look like, and some of these other practices that are moving more towards life-centered approaches? And so it's a little bit of a long haul. As you know, in the industry you're in, there's a lot of capacity building that even if we had clients that are looking to do large-scale land restoration projects, well, there's a lot of capacity and supply of that expertise that still needs to grow out, and certainly there's a demand growth that needs to happen over time. So it's a little bit of a process that is something I'm enjoying, and something that I'm recognizing is a role for my company to play to bridge these ways over time.
Yeah, I really actually find that approach to be very smart and strategic, because you're, like you're saying, going after the low-hanging fruit. You're pursuing attainable goals for your clients, leveraging the government IRA funding, which, by the way, why do they call it the Inflation Reduction Act if it was really an environmental funding program? Do you understand that?
Well, at the time it was published, there was a massive inflation issue, right? And it's kind of a joke in the way that lots and lots of government bills are named, and they aren't necessarily named for the things that they're actually doing. And I won't get into examples, but there's some funny ones. But the Inflation Reduction Act it's largely political, right? In order to get votes and get things passed, there's ways that need to happen. There's wording that needs to matter. The Inflation Reduction Act is primarily environmental. It's got 133 programs in it, but it also funds prescription drug reform. It funds a bunch of IRS audits that supposedly are going to help fund all these things. And so it was pitched as an attempt to get votes as something that would reduce inflation.
Okay, I guess I understand that. I always found it a little bit of a misnomer, but it does have a lot of it does have a lot of resources and funding for investment in renewable energy and environmental programs, which regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum with regards to government spending and government programs, our philosophy as business owners, my sisters and I, is if they're giving out the money, we should go out and get it, right? I mean, if it's there, like we should learn about it and apply for it. And so we did that, in fact, with you. We partnered with you to get funding for a solar project down in Vero Beach at our new cold storage facility, because we use a lot of energy to keep those cold rooms cold for the citrus. I think our energy bill is something like $50,000 to $70,000 a month. And so we were able to work with you to secure a grant for that solar project, which you probably know a little bit more about it than I do. Could you describe what the scale of our project is and how the grant worked?
Yeah, so the project as it was submitted for the application, I think is close to finalized design, was a ground mount 2 megawatt solar system, which is, for those listening, is about the largest that you can get before you have to go through a different utility scale permitting project, which is a very different process. So when you say it's a 2 megawatt solar project, it's as big as it's going to be unless it's done by a utility or in conjunction with the utility at that massive scale. So large solar project. With that, there are some general tax credits that you're eligible for. It's a 30% investment tax credit that will give you 30% of your investment off your taxes right away. There's also other depreciation benefits and expenses that you can have. And then the program we worked on together was a grant program through the USDA called the Rural Energy for America program, REAP, which provided, actually in many cases, it provides 50% of the cost of the project in a taxable grant. But in your case, your project was so large, there's a cap on it. It was capped at $1 million, and so your project will get $1 million in this REAP funding to help offset the cost of the project and make this probably the best deal you could possibly get on solar for that scale for your farm.
Yeah, it's great. We're so excited about this because we're going to have a solar installation to help offset our energy costs at the facility. It's going to be, I think, something we can be very proud of. And I want to trial growing various ground cover systems under these panels because we're being asked by FPL and other utilities to help them think about how to manage the ground cover and the landscape systems around the larger solar fields that they're doing. And we have some ideas, but we don't really have true solutions yet because we just need to try it out and learn. So that's what we're doing. But so back to your story about, kind of this approach of using the low-hanging fruit to capture your client's interest and attention, and then maybe trying to develop them to think a little more deeply about how they can incorporate life-centered practices in their business and to get to think more about how they can bring regeneration into their work. Have you had that success kind of going to the next step with the client? Have you been able to lead them down that path?
To the degree that I would hope for, not really yet. We did, the project at Raymond James Stadium. We've done some beautiful butterfly gardens at elementary schools and some different projects like that. But there's, I think it's a process that takes some time, and a lot of the funding projects that I'm dealing with chief operating officer, chief financial officer, very business oriented folks, whereas a lot of the more regenerative land management type project of changing out how you're doing landscaping and changing the way that you do business is very cross departmental. Right, so it touches your community relations, maybe if you have a sustainability department, it touches marketing, it touches, if your landscaping could be, operational expenses, and so it's a more complicated development process. And so for most of the projects that we're working on, we've had a few like kind of 6-month full scale engagements across things, including the school system that I mentioned, of working with them on their overall sustainability plan. But to turn that into, say, this school district is regenerative or on that path is a little bit of a process.
It takes time. We keep coming up on this in landscape and agriculture. Any kind of regenerative system requires 3 to 4 years to start to establish itself, where you get into those compounding benefits and network effects, whether it's a cover crop system or it's a ground cover system, a native landscape. There's this requisite 3 to 4 year incubation period to build enough energy and to build enough really connections and relationships for that system to start to thrive. At least that's something I keep observing. And honestly, when I think about all of the various business ventures that this company has pursued, whether it was launching the landscape maintenance company or launching the citrus import side of things or launching the landscape contracting side, as we diversify, we create businesses, it takes at least 3 to 4 years to get something off the ground, to get it where it has any kind of momentum at all. Mm-hmm. And so I think patience is the key, and persistence, because a lot of people tend to give up in those first 3 to 4 years because they're not seeing enough success to gratify kind of their desire for progress. And I suspect a lot of entrepreneurs probably abandon the initiative right before it blooms. So I encourage you to keep on going with this this idea of changing the mindset of business owners, which I think that's kind of at the core of your strategy.
Yeah, and I think I agree with all that. Where there's, I think, a big opportunity that comes, and there've been many conversations, and some of this for me has been a refining of what my core skill set is and what the business is going to be focused on. Early on, there wasn't a lot of capacity for things, but I had clients that wanted to do butterfly gardens, and without a sod cutter, me and one other person spent half a day or more than that digging out 400 square feet of sod to to build this butterfly garden at an elementary school, and learning there are partnerships that would make sense to have. So now we work with several gardeners, and a lot of that becomes referral, becomes supporting other businesses as they're growing in the space. And more of the focus of Regenerative Shift, certainly some of that's been on the tax incentive side of things. And then a lot of the focus is, and something we've talked about, maybe we'll get in more, is on the regional scale and on working through the work that I'm doing with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council on recognizing there are different scales for this discussion that take place. And so, yes, there's discussions to be had for your individual yard. There's massive discussions to be had at the business level and what a business can do. But where I'm finding a lot of the fruit being ripe and ready to pick is at the regional scale, and working with our regional planning council on how do we start to coordinate some of these resiliency actions across the 28 members of the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council in a way that is life-centered, and seeing a lot more interest and opportunity even at that scale necessarily than maybe at smaller scales.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me what you're saying, because there are a lot of different scales at which we can focus our energy and action, and I think they're all important, and they all have maybe their different timelines. So let's talk about the regional and bioregional scale, because I know that's something that you've really focused a lot on recently. So tell us, what is a regional planning council to begin with, and how are you working with the regional planning council in your area?
Yeah. So regional planning councils are generally, I think across the board, are government entities, and sometimes non-government stakeholders that come together and realize that some coordination is required across jurisdictional boundaries. So if you're doing a transportation system, that very well could cross city or county boundaries to be a meaningful transportation system, or food systems, or conservation and wildlife corridors. A lot of these housing situations can cross county lines and city lines. And so for many, many years in the Tampa Bay region, the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council has existed for, I think, 30 years or so, in some capacity of recognizing that the city of Tampa is not an island. It's part of an ecosystem of other jurisdictions, and how do we come together and work across those boundaries for more efficiencies and for better coordination. In Tampa Bay with the Regional Planning Council, there's also been a big realization around resiliency and the importance of regional coordination for resiliency efforts. We just got hit with major hurricanes, 2 of them this last fall, and a lot of the conversation was at a regional level of how do we make, it's not about if the city has enough resources, it's all of us here together and the power's out. How do we get the resources, the people we need across these jurisdictions? And so the Regional Planning Council can be very effective at that type of resiliency discussion. The work that I've been doing for the last about 2 years has been with one of the working group, well, I guess a little bit of a step back. The Resiliency Coalition of the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council 2.5 years ago published a regional resiliency action plan that had 10 goals across various topics on how to build resilience. So, for example, goal 4 is resilience in the built environment. And so I ended up attending and then ultimately being asked with a woman, Maria Scambati, to be the co-chair of the Resilient Land Use Working Group under the Regional Planning Council. And so this is a community-led working group that is designed to create the space for action around the Resiliency Action Plan. And so there are 3 goals from the Resiliency Action Plan that committee focuses on. It's goal 4, which is resiliency in the built environment. There's goal 5, which is resiliency in the natural environment. And goal 8, which is a regional food system. And so we are in the stakeholder engagement early process, but kind of working through recognizing, mapping out, well, what's going on and how do we start to coordinate these things that we can then turn into actionable items that can go in front of the 28 member governments of the Regional Planning Council to become ordinances, become law, become actions that we take towards resiliency in our region around those 3 goals.
That's fascinating, because now you're really coordinating across stakeholders, across jurisdictions, and thinking about planning for resilience at, I think, the level and scale that is required to create systems that will help to ensure that our future actions will be in alignment with the goal that we have. Mm-hmm. And that goal is to be sustainable and to be resilient to storms, to be resilient to population growth, to be resilient to all of the pressures that Florida is starting to experience. And it gives me a lot of hope to hear that the Regional Planning Council is actually studying these issues and thinking about how do we solve for those types of goals. So how do you find the transition from working with businesses to working with government? Is there similarities, differences in how you appeal to those different groups?
I think it's largely similar, in that you have to speak a language, you have to be able to speak and kind of understand what their goals are. So in the case of businesses, very commonly it's some form of profit-making entity that needs to, meet certain KPIs or have certain outcomes related to revenue, expenses, profits. And so anything that you're dealing with needs to come from that lens, or it's going to be really difficult to done. There are some organizations that may have a sustainability department, and certainly community relations, and some of these may be more altruistic things, maybe coming from really good places, but all of that fits within a framework of a business that typically needs to make profit in order to do so. And so being able to communicate the language of how does this fit into a profit model works very well when you're, say, you do this solar project, Tim, and get $1 million grant for it, that fits into that business model pretty well, right? At the municipal scale, there's certainly that. There's absolutely budgets that play into factor. There's political factors that go in. But it's kind of working, and again, with the Regional Planning Council, there is a framework that is already published, that's already out there, that says we have decided and signed off on to say we have a regional resiliency action plan. We want to be more resilient across these 10 goals in our region through these 80 or so actions that are under that. And so a language that is effective is to say, here is something that speaks to one of these goals and how it addresses that goal and how it can help, right? And hopefully in a way that fits a budget, right? There has to be all of that level. I think there's a lot of similarities between how businesses and municipalities are run in that way. And in both cases, I think there's a lot of openness to conversations if framed in a from a pragmatic standpoint. To there's a lot of desire for business to do business in a way that's not detrimental to the environment. There's certainly at a regional level, and all of our member governments, everybody wants to be more sustainable. They want to have a long-term health in our region. There are a lot of competing factors, and there's a lot of other priorities as well. So trying to figure out how to solve for these life-centered questions, not changing the not ignoring the profit or the politics or that, but like adding in kind of looking more holistically at it gives you the opportunity to create better solutions.
Exactly. It's really a matter of yes and. Mm-hmm. Yes, profit and politics are real. They are manifest in this system. We have to acknowledge them. And we can also create a more resilient and regenerative system if we just start to solve for the right problems. And I think what you just said was very clear to me, that there's similarities in the way that you can address businesses and governments, thinking about budgets and goals and aligning with what's important to them. But that's actually, I don't think it's common sense thinking. That usually people think that dealing with private sector and dealing with government is like dealing with two completely separate worlds. But the way you just described it, you're bringing it back together. Just to identify what people are trying to accomplish, based on their framework of incentives, based on the goals that they have, based on the constraints that they have, based on the way that they are recognized and incentivized. Ultimately, is I think the common underlying factor that connects these worlds. And I've been thinking a lot about a project for a Florida dashboard. I'd be real curious to get your thoughts on this, because in business, we focus a lot on KPIs and dashboards. They're super useful. It's definitely a very effective way of aligning a large group of people, tracking our progress, motivating us to find innovative solutions to problems that move the needle, to find innovative solutions to move the needle in the direction of our desired outcomes. Yes, setting the right goals is sometimes tricky. You can go down the wrong path, thinking that, okay, this is my goal, but it turns out that if you set the wrong goal, you can go a little astray. But with some thoughtfulness, you can set the right goals. Mm-hmm. Usually, it's balance. Multiple types of factors, not just profit. In our business, we like to think about goals that have to do with safety, goals that have to do with efficiency, goals that have to do with quality, goals that have to do with customer engagement and experience, employee engagement experience, as well as profit. And you start to create these dashboards that are dynamic and balanced. So I'm thinking about that in terms of the state. Mm-hmm. We have so many people working towards what I think are very much the same goals, in terms of we want a more sustainable future. We want to manage our natural resources. We want to leave the state in a better state than we found it for our children. We want to address our water quality issues and our wildlife issues and our conservation corridors. We want to find smarter, more sustainable ways to build housing for people. We want to address our health and our food systems. People are generally working on these things across the state. We don't have a state dashboard. We have a global dashboard if you consider the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals,
Sure.
right? That's 17 goals for the world. I think those are great goals. There's the Earth Charter.
Yep.
That's another example of a framework of global goals. So I see we have global goals. I understand how goals work in a private enterprise. What if we had a well-crafted, well-designed dashboard for the state of Florida with KPIs that measure things that we can more or less agree on across a range of different themes? I think that would be really powerful in aligning all of this energy that's being put out there by NGOs, by governments, by individuals such as you and me, by private businesses that are already working in this direction but lack something to really align and coordinate. So what do you think about this idea of a Florida dashboard?
Well, I think, at a certain level, if you're not measuring things, then how do you know what your results are, right? So I think the idea of establishing dashboards at certain scales and having metrics is a really important thing to do. The Sustainable Development Goals, I might, if I was drafting, might draft things a little bit differently, but largely, yes, all these things are really effective. The question that I would have on a Florida dashboard is why Florida, right? Other than the fact that we have a state boundary there, that certainly makes sense. We have, kind of locally in Tampa, we have a dashboard that's a habitat scorecard that's put by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program that's looking at variety of different metrics on water quality testing and habitat loss and wildlife corridors and stuff within our estuary of the Tampa Bay region. And that's a really effective scale because at that scale, you can, it's generally one watershed, one system that is fitting together. And so measuring the metrics on the health of Tampa Bay at that bioregional scale works really well. At a state level, it depends on the metrics, right? Like on what you're doing. Certain things, energy production would make a lot of sense in Florida. Like Florida doesn't have any coal or natural gas or oil, so the only thing that we really can produce is we have a lot of sunlight, right? So looking at a metric of how much renewable energy we have would make a lot of sense at a statewide level due to how we draw those boundaries. I just wonder, I think it's great, and I guess political boundaries do exist there. My question is, are the KPIs something that are affected at that state level, or are they things that are affected at more regional scales within the state?
That's an excellent question. Why Florida? I think I assume Florida because of the political boundaries, and also because a lot of organizations in Florida are kind of organized already at the state level.
That's fair.
But I do like this idea of more of a eco-region or bioregional approach to coordination. So I wonder if you could have nested goals. You have an architecture of nested goals that you have regional goals that roll up to statewide KPIs. And in some cases that probably is possible, in other cases maybe not. But I do like the idea of creating something that has enough support across a broad range of stakeholders and Floridians to say, okay, we collectively agree on the importance of improving these metrics.
Yep.
We may not agree on everything. We may not even agree on how to improve the metrics, but we can agree that if these metrics improve, that's a good thing.
Yep.
I think that would facilitate a lot of coordination, as well as, like you said, you improve what you measure. There's no doubt about that. As soon as we start advertising or publicizing that these goals exist, that they are trackable, transparent, and people start paying attention, I think you'll see faster progress just by the very nature of you improve what you measure. But the power of coordination is what I'm really intrigued by. And one of the organizations that's doing what I think an amazing job in terms of coordinating across the state is an organization you're involved with, and that's the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation. Mm-hmm. They've done a tremendous job of reaching out to a lot of different stakeholders and creating a really broad-based coalition of Floridians who come from a lot of different walks of life and sectors. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit. What has been your involvement with the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation?
Yeah. Well, I think, if I was looking at a statewide organization that had a life-centered focus to it at scale, Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation would probably be, if not the top, very high on the list of organizations that is life-centered. It's all around how do we protect the corridors for the panther and the bear and for many other animals along the way. And so very closely aligned with their mission and a supporter of what they do. The work that I actually am involved with them came out of actually where we first met, and some of the work that you're doing at Sunbridge, which I don't know how much your listeners are aware of or not. The work I'm on the Corridor Compatible Communities Committee, the 4Cs, that is looking at recognizing, so there's however many 800,000 acres or whatever it is, some large chunk of acres that are in this Florida Wildlife Corridor that are already conserved, and then there are others that's privately owned, publicly owned, but not in conservation and zoned to whatever development rights are in those zones, and kind of recognizing that while it would be nice from certainly from a Florida Panthers perspective to stop development through the spine of Florida and give a nice 1,000-mile habitat for them, that there's other design considerations, including the growing population, the need for housing, and all these other things within spaces that are within a wildlife corridor that currently is being occupied by animals. And so there's a way to do development that is the business as usual development would do a lot of clear cutting and plant a few palm trees, and wildlife corridor is decimated through that development process. But there are ways like Sunbridge and like other communities that are out there, and that some design standards we're working on as well. If you wanted to develop within the official Florida Wildlife Corridor, or broadly anywhere that is land that's developed, how do you do that in a way that's compatible with the wildlife corridors within that region, right? And so we're in the process of publishing guidelines. I think they're planned on being published in June at the upcoming Corridor Connect conference, that will talk through best practices for land management and landscaping and water management and pathways and lighting and energy use and waste diversion. Pretty wide swath of topics covered by this corridor compatible communities document that will then be able to be shared with the developers that are going to be developing these projects at present, not with any ordinance behind it or anything, but just as hey, these are best practices, and if you want to develop in a way that is life-centered, this is the way that you can do it. And so I've had some work with that team as they're putting that together, and really find a lot of value in that.
Yeah, I had a chance to preview the document as part of a input review committee, and it's fantastic. I felt that it was really helpful as a training or educational tool for somebody who wants to know what would I do if I wanted to create a more sustainable development project that was compatible with the corridor, as you put it, that puts life at the center of the development process. And it does walk you through step by step all of these different dimensions of development where you can implement practices. And I think some of those practices are not necessarily going to add cost to the development project. Maybe certainly some of them would, but others it's more just it's a different way of solving the problem, kind of like the aluminum fence story that you told earlier. It's like if you start thinking about your project a little differently, you have all these other solutions or ways that you can approach it, and that's what that document seems to do. It's a really good set of guidelines.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited about the work of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, because I love Florida. I love being outdoors. I love the wild animals. On our farms we have panthers, we have bears, we have deer, and I get to see a side of Florida that perhaps a lot of people who recently moved to Orlando or Tampa or Miami and haven't gotten a chance to get out, maybe they don't even know about. But there's something really special about Florida. And preserving and protecting that, I think, is an incredibly important mission and purpose. And there's a lot of things that we can do, but we have to conserve land. We have to protect land forever and put it into conservation before it's too late. In addition to changing the way that we landscape and addressing sustainable development and things, conserving land is critical, and what that group has done to promote that is really important, very, very special. And in fact, we have a couple properties that we may ultimately put an easement on or sell to the state for conservation, because they're right along the path of the corridor.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And it's important that we have that option to sell the easement or sell the land. As a farmer, we're landowners. And if we are, we can no longer farm, like for example, with the citrus greening, some farms we just can't continue to farm. You can't hold on to that property without income, because you got to pay property taxes, you got to maintain the roads, you got to maintain the ditches. I mean, there's a lot of the cost of holding property. So if I don't have agricultural income on that property, then I'm in a situation where I need to sell the property. And if the only buyer is a developer or home builder, well, that's what's going to happen. I'm going to sell the property to the developer or home builder. Even if in my heart I wish to conserve that property, I wish it could stay forever natural, I can't afford to. So what the state has done by providing all this funding through Florida Forever program and the Rural Family Lands Protection program is they've actually created a market. They created an alternative for landowners who can now have a choice to sell either to a developer or sell to conservation. And that's really important, because most farmers that I know, they have a heart for conservation.
Of course.
They have a huge heart for conservation. I wish people could see the Everglades, if they haven't seen them. I was down there recently, and it's so mesmerizing. It feels like you're on a different continent. You might as well be in Africa or somewhere.
Yeah.
It's so wild. It's so large and expansive. It just goes on and on and on, and purely wild and natural. And that's something that is very special. It does not exist everywhere. You can go to just about every other state in the continental United States, and you're not going to find something like that.
Right.
I'm sure there's some spectacular things out west, but what we have here in Florida is worth protecting.
It is. Yeah, Florida is, this is home for me. In my home is Tampa, and I look at that at regional level, but at a state level, there's a reason why people move here. There's a reason why, we've developed there's so much pressure to develop, and it's because of the amazing abundance of natural resources and even just our water, right? And the amount of water and the quality of water that we have in our springs creates enormous riches that, sometimes I don't know that we properly value. I think through conservation and through, different practices, we can maintain these resources. But yeah, no, Florida's a special place. I think we agree.
So your work is really important, and you're working at different scales, like we talked about, working with businesses, working with the Regional Planning Council, working with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and to make your work all about regeneration and bringing life back to the center of how we think about our problems and our solutions. I think that's really spectacular, very bold, very innovative, and I give you a lot of credit for that, because it sounded like you were doing really well at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That would be a dream job for a lot of people.
And it was for me. It was for me too.
Yeah. And to make that shift, very courageous. So, what is your vision for how regeneration gains traction in Florida? What are the next steps or the next frontiers for continuing to gain momentum?
So it's a great question. So So I talked a little bit about the history of regeneration flowing out of agriculture into like life-centered decision making and systems thinking at different scales, right? And that's been for many years. That's culminated. There's been a permaculture movement that has been largely individual landscapes and what do you do to create food forests and nature-based opportunities within landscapes. And there's projects of different scales and sizes in that space too. Where I think the frontier of regenerative thought for me is at this point is around the bioregional scale, the eco-regional scale, like we were talking about. So, and I told you the story earlier about this lake in my backyard, but there's limits to as I live on a lake that has 20 homes around it, and as an individual homeowner, what I do matters. I can choose to whether I put fertilizer on my lawn and what my practices are and what I plant near the shorelines or don't, or if I build a seawall or if I don't. That certainly matters to the lake, but I can't do it on an island. There's 19 other houses that are around me. And even those 19 houses, even though we have the example of a pretty good community effort that we did, there's a storm drain that flows into the lake that has nitrogen and phosphorus that has nothing to do with what we're doing. Even if we came together, it's flowing from upstream, right? Flowing from the systems that we have off the asphalt from other reservoirs of water and stuff. And so it's really hard to do regeneration at a individual level or even a community level in some scale, although certainly community level can be impactful at certain scales. But in the Tampa Bay region, if we wanted to regenerate Tampa Bay, right? We a year ago, last March, we hosted an event at Sweetwater Farm in Town and Country called Regenerate Tampa Bay, and had the audacity of asking the question of like, well, what would it take to regenerate Tampa Bay? And if you're looking at that from a metric of water quality or fish population or any of these metrics that you might use as your KPI for the health of Tampa Bay, if you start looking at it, it becomes pretty obvious that you're not just in the bay. There are 5 tributary rivers that flow into Tampa Bay, and you have to look at all of that. And there's all this land that has runoff that's flowing to these rivers and stuff. But so like at a scale of a scale of doing something in the Tampa Bay area, there is actually a lot that we could do bioregionally, right? Like it's a relatively closed loop hydrological cycle. Generally speaking, the water evaporates off the bay, rains down, sinks down into aquifers, and then flows down in springs and rivers back into the bay. And if we as a region, not saying it's easy to do, but if we as a region put a KPI to say, hey, water quality of Tampa Bay is going to be something that we're designing for, it's actually something at this scale. We could have really high quality water. We could have really high quality air. We could have wildlife corridors and thriving biodiversity within our bioregion, because that's one of the primary ways that nature organizes itself. We have all this opportunity to do things there. And so I think the bioregional scale and realizing that, they're right in my region where I'm most familiar, there are thousands, it may be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who are doing some little puzzle pieces that relates to environmental action, whether that's in their own yard or, at the scale of maybe the estuary program that's doing stuff at a regional scale. But what we don't have right now fully is, this design framework to say, hey, this is what we're designing for. We're designing for a resilient bioregion, a healthy bioregion, the health of our water at scale, and how does our development and our food systems and our housing and our social systems and transportation fit into this overall design goal. We don't have that framework yet. And I think it's such an effective scale to design and to implement that I think that's a big frontier. And then I'll add to it, there's also, within the bioregional movement, there's also the frontier of how do we fund this, right? Because as I talked about it earlier, there's budgets for everything, whether it's a business, a homeowner, a municipality. There's only, presumably there's finite resources, right? And so how do we get the funding flowing into this? And there's this whole movement of, it's called flow funding, and it's there's Samantha Power and the BioFi project is one that's doing it, and there's Gitcoin that's doing it in crypto. There's all this frontier of financing of people who recognize that we want to fund the people that are doing the planning work and the coordination work at these bioregional levels at different bioregions around the world, and how do we flow funding into that and to do that and stuff. And so that's been a lot of my more cutting edge emerging things. I have built a business off of how to get federal funding to spark environmental action. So kind of looking at that skill set, how do we do that to really flow into the regenerative action as well?
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you're talking about three different things. One is to organize and coordinate efforts at the bioregional level, where we have a lot of natural systems that are organized at that ecoregion or bioregional level. Two is to set the right goals about what we're trying to improve and to make sure that there's alignment around those goals. And three is to flow funding into those efforts.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. I think that's a really lucid way to think about the future of regeneration. From a funding standpoint, I know that having clearly defined goals is the key. And if you are trying to get money from funders, whether they're banks or grant programs or investors, you need to be clear about what you're aiming to do and how you're going to measure your success. And if you can show that and it's compelling, then you can get the funding. So one leads to the other. And so we're back to these KPIs. And maybe it's not at the Florida level as I initially suggested it, and maybe it is at the regional level. I was fishing in the Sarasota Bay last week. I don't fish a lot, but I was invited by Brightman Logan, who was on this podcast, and I actually know the Sarasota Bay very well because I went to school in Sarasota at New College, and our campus was on the bay.
Okay.
So I spent a lot of time there. I've seen my share of red tides. But we were out there and we had chartered a little fishing vessel with the captain who'd grown up on those waters, and I'm sure his father before him, and he knew that bay like the back of his hand. And he could take you, to where the fish were. Mm-hmm. So we caught a lot of fish. And it was really, I thought it was so precious to observe his relationship with that ecosystem, just how well he understood the tides, how well he understood the fish, and he understood the grass flats, and he understood the currents, and just such knowledge and such intimate understanding of this area, this natural system and resource. But he was a little bit down, about the state of the bay. The water quality, the fish populations, the red tides, the grass, the turtle grass populations. And he wasn't, completely depressed, but, he wasn't very optimistic. And I was struck by that, because it was such a beautiful day, and on the surface of the water, I mean, it still felt like good quality recreation. Mm-hmm. But underneath that, there is something that we're losing. One day at a time, we are losing the value and the function of these systems. I think they're going to come back because I'm very optimistic about the power of nature to be resilient. Mm-hmm. But we're I guess we're taking it down to the wire, as a community before we snap into action. I guess I'm just telling this story because you're talking about Tampa Bay and I was out there. What are your thoughts on the health of Tampa Bay and how it turns around? And, is there a tipping point where it's too far and too late?
Well, I think, for one, I think it's important, there's the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, which is a great organization that's been doing a lot of work, there's a lot of data. There has been, under certain metrics, there's been a lot of improvement in the bay over the last 20, 30 years with some of the efforts that that's a big umbrella organization that funds a lot of different projects with a lot of different organizations, but a lot of really good work has taken place there. But you can't ignore when you have, like we did in 2021, the red tide that I think 900 manatees and Pinellas County picked up 5 million pounds of fish out of the water, and some of this stuff that, with the red tide that caused all that damage after the Piney Point situation. We're teetering with these systems, right? There are tipping points. There is resiliency. I do believe that there's an opportunity for nature to come back. But if we continue to develop and poison and overfish and do some of the things that we've done, like acting like these resources are infinite, I think we're already seeing some of those ramifications. And I think that we're past, for me, I really know it was interesting. I started my company in July of 2021, and that was literally the month that the big red tide of 2021 came out. And so I'm, a few weeks into having my business started and getting calls from people that I told I'm, leaving the Bucs. I'm starting this environmental consulting firm, and had friends, call me, we got to do something. My kids can't fish. Like, this isn't, one of my big early clients was a construction company that called me when that happened, said, okay, like, we got to do something. We can't continue to let this happen. I think there's a love for the Bay in my region. There's an acknowledgement that our economy exists within our ecology, and that if we have red tides or whatever else, if Tampa Bay is dead, we don't have a regional economy to live off of anymore. Like that's, I think, probably pretty widely known, certainly in circles that I'm having conversations. And so I think there's a acknowledgement of that. It just then becomes, how do we change the conversation on all these incremental little things? Because that's all well and good, but then there's this coastal property right here that just got blown down in a hurricane, and do you rebuild, or does somebody lose a lot of economic value? And those are hard questions. And I don't even pretend to know all the answers to those types of things. But when you have, whether it's the Bay or the wildlife corridor, you've got all these people moving here, and there's opportunities for, in some cases, affordable housing projects that you'd like to see happen, or even whatever type of housing project to give people homes, and, the yards that the American dream yards and all this different stuff that we want to have. But that comes at a cost and a trade-off to the environment. And we have had a long period of time where there was so much abundance available in nature that these little paper cuts didn't really didn't add up, or didn't seem to add up, and we didn't notice it. I think we're past that point. And so now we have to be, I think, a lot more strategic about the ways we develop, the ways we interact with nature, and certainly, I would argue strongly, for the things we do to restore and regenerate nature.
We do. And I think it's going to start happening. I think you're going to see more and more investment and funding flowing in this direction, more and more conversations being had where there's a real genuine and authentic interest in finding solutions, system-wide solutions to improving outcomes that'll generate momentum. And I believe that, but I think it takes people like you and people all over the state to take a chance and to be courageous about making this the focus of their work. But there's something about the red tide that it's so in your face. Like, if you haven't experienced a red tide, you don't know. But I mean, it makes your skin burn, your eyes burn. It smells like death. It's really, really profound, and it lingers. It lasts for weeks, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably have experienced it more recently than I. I mean, how nasty is this?
Yeah, I mean, the big one we had in 2021 was, I take a guess and say about 6 weeks, where beachfront hotels closed and shut down or had no vacancy, where there were signs posted on the beach that say no swimming, where people were being hospitalized with respiratory issues from just walking on boardwalks down by the beach. It's in your face. It's hard to miss. And then different scales. Like if you ever been around other fish kills and things like that, I had a big fish kill in my lake a few years ago, and you can't clean it up. You just have to wait for it to take its couple week course for the buzzards to finally, eat as much as they can, because it's overwhelming the amount of loss of life that these types of events can cause.
Yeah, these red tides, you're confronted with the magnitude of death. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. All the fish are dying, and your mission of putting life back at the center of business, to me, again, it resonates, because if we're not careful with the way that we choose to organize our communities and our state, we're going to be promoting death. Mm-hmm. Death of our estuaries, death of our megafauna, death of our soils. And eventually that's going to catch up to human systems, and before we get to death, I think it's going to manifest as disease and poor health outcomes. I think that's one of the really interesting things that you and Maria are working on, is talking about bioregional regeneration in terms of human health. Mm-hmm. Because what we all agree on, I think, is that we want to be healthy, we want to celebrate life, and we want to promote life. I think that's universal, and that's why we have to maybe sometimes get back to speaking in the most plain and direct way possible. And to say we want to put life back at the center, to me, is the most direct way of saying what we all want and can agree on. The trade-offs is the hard part. What do you have to give up in order to ultimately to promote that way of thinking and that way of being in the world. But those are the hard problems that are ours to solve. Mm-hmm. As our generation and the next generation will be working on this. And as a result of having to work on these issues, I think we're creating new markets. We're creating new blue oceans and opportunities for entrepreneurs and businesses and startups and economies to emerge and to grow. And that's the exciting part about this, is in the process of addressing these issues that we've discussed, we're creating economic opportunity and wealth for people, for our generation and the next, that is also going to be deeply meaningful and purposeful. And I think that is what we can all look forward to.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I've studied is, I guess you could call it like evolutionary biology, and looking at like how living systems function. And one of the things that living systems do is they create the space for more life and more complexity to develop and more abundance to develop, very typically. And so I think we as humans have benefited from that immensely, right? Like, and have, overshot, right? There's, we, a couple hundred years ago came into this abundance of fossil fuels that was, a resource that, created this incredibly cheap energy that allowed us to scale all over the planet and do all these different things with really a, unsustainable approach to it, from a variety of methods, even in just how fast we use it versus how fast it's replenished, before you get into any of the other cascading effects of it from pollution and different things like that. But that is really the abnormal behavior of nature, right? That the nature at its core creates the conditions for more complexity and more life to thrive. And so I think there's an enormous opportunity for humanity to reassume its mantle as a keystone species, where through our ingenuity, through our innovation, through the way we structure business, we create the opportunities for abundance, we create the opportunities for thriving ecosystems to exist. And that's one of the paths that's before us. There's another path, and I'm not big in dualism of this path or that path. There's a lot of nuance, but there's a path of abundance that we can take, a path of regeneration. There's also a path towards extinction and a path towards death, as we talked about there. And I think I'm quite confident that humanity will wake up. I'm seeing it every day as I have more conversations. 3 or 4 years ago, the conversations and scales of influence of these types of ideas are very different than they are today. There's a lot more acceptance and interest and curiosity around these ideas, and it's like becomes, you walk into some places and it seems like common sense to say, yeah, we should use our ingenuity to create life, and people are like, yeah, that makes sense. Even in a few years, that's kind of shifted to be more like that. But there are different crises come, whether it's hurricanes that hit our region in the fall, that was very sobering for our leadership as we recognized that we were unprepared for that. And those hurricanes, while big, were not the worst case scenarios. And if worst case scenarios come, we're not going to be prepared for them. I think there's opportunities for wake up calls, and those wake up calls create the opportunities for regional coordination, for larger scale coordination, but around the right design goals towards how do we create more life through what we're doing. And I think we'll get it. There's probably some harm along the way still to happen as we have these growing pains as a species. But I think, in the long term, I guess at a minimum, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll figure it out. And nature continues to show resilience. I saw something a little while ago about Chernobyl and what's happened in Chernobyl since it was, nuked, turned into a nuclear fallout zone and left alone for like 50 years. And some of what nature has done there, there's fungus that is like eating the radioactivity, and there's thriving species. There's all this stuff in, areas that we've decimated. Nature pretty quickly comes back in those spaces. And so, my personal mission is how do we use our ingenuity to help that process rather than to force nature to do it without us.
Well, the name of your company is Regenerative Shift, and I love that. I think you nailed it just with the name. That's really what it's all about. We just need to pivot, make that shift, awaken to our impact in the world, and embrace nature and life as the heart and the center of what we're here to do. And if we just start thinking a little bit differently, I think we're going to find that we can have everything that we need and want. We're not going to have to give up any comfort. We're not going to have to give up, anything that we can't live without. And in return, we're going to gain abundance. And that's where we're heading. And I thank you, Caleb, for your leadership. You have a very strong voice, and you need to use that voice to keep educating and inspiring people as you've been doing now for years. And because it's really important. I think it takes people like you to be out there and encouraging people to make that shift. And that's what I also try to do in my own way. And there's a community of people out there now in Florida and beyond that are doing that, and that's going to be the path to finding our way. And so thank you for this conversation today.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that there are many people that are doing incredible work, and in some cases I'm blown away. You were telling the story of the fisherman who knew Sarasota Bay so well, and it reminded me of this guy I met at a tree planting. It was actually, we weren't even tree planting. We were removing invasives to prepare for a tree planting. And it was on HCC's Plant City campus, and he told me the story of this creek that he had could map all the way from where this creek ran all the way into the bay, and it spent literally 30 years that used to be, it had dried out, and he's got this creek running through HCC Plant City campus again through this work that he did with his nonprofit, and kind of as his life outcome was to get water flowing through this one creek again, which that's a big task. It's a hard thing to do. And I think, so there's people who've been doing these things for many, many years, for generations, that I think, now we can come together. I think there's more of an appetite from our member governments and from our businesses to say, yes, we're open to these solutions. And so it creates the opportunity for a lot of these experts and people who've been passionate about doing this and doing things on the fringes to come and help more in the, as be a part of the innovators for the solution, for the future.
Absolutely. We need everybody to come together and work together. So let's keep it keep it going.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.